take decisions, you should avoid bias. And bias basically means the three impurities as I've already talked about. Avoid letting greed or hatred or delusion influence the decisions which you make. And also fear as well. Avoid allowing fear to influence your better judgment. And meditate regularly. If you can take care of this, it's known as practicing to purify yourself. So it's like filling up the water in the big tank where your negligible amount of salt is still lurking. But also you have to learn how to apply purity on the social level as well. Supposing your work involves other people and the decisions which you make affect other people's lives as well. You have to learn how to apply your own example so that the decisions you make don't affect other people's lives adversely as well. If you were just responsible for yourself, then life would be quite simple. Really, you could be quite a selfish person and no one would really care very much. It's like the bachelor who only needs to care about having food on his own plate. No one can blame him for that, because no one else is dependent on him. But supposing he gets married and has a family, and he's still only interested in having food on his own plate, then people would blame him for being selfish, because he's not thinking of the other members of his family. Once he changes his circle of influence, then he also has to change his way of thinking. He has to give himself an upgrade. And you could think of it in terms of he has to expand his awareness outside of himself to all of his family members as well, so that all the family members have food on their plates. Maybe he would be the last one to have food on his plate. That would be more acceptable. If he is made the mayor of his town and he's still only thinking about his own family, and he wants just members of his family in all the important positions in that village, then again people would say he's selfish. So he'd have to stop thinking of himself, stop thinking of just his family, and think about the good of everyone in that village if he was to do that job well. So that means he'd have to expand his awareness even further, not just to his family but to all the people in the village as well. Otherwise he'd be said to be a bad mayor. Suppose he's made president and he's just thinking about his own village. Again, he'd be blamed for that. But there are quite well-known examples of people who have spent all the government's funds just to do up their own hometown and forget about the rest of the country. Plenty of examples of that in history. It seems that it's not the easiest of things to do. Really, if you're in that position, then you have to have an awareness which is broad enough to extend to the whole nation who you look after. And although examples of this are sometimes few and far between, we tend to find more faults with world leaders these days than we do qualities. But there are examples, good examples to be had, at least partial ones, or from time to time. And in Buddhism we have a set of guidelines which have been passed down for rulers or kings to follow, to remind them that just because you're king doesn't mean you can do anything. If you're a king and you're not a good king, then you have a disaster on your hands as well. And some of these might be quite interesting reading for some of the world leaders we have in the present day. Said that if you are leading a nation, then the first thing you have to have is generosity, to be able to share what you have with other people who are in need. You have to have self-discipline, so that means being able to keep the precepts yourself. If the royal family isn't an example of morality, then they can hardly expect the other people in the country to be better than themselves. In the olden days, if the country ran into problems, then the royal family would keep 8 precepts. For those of you who know 8 precepts, until things sorted themselves out. For example, if it didn't rain, then the whole royal family would keep 8 precepts until it did rain. It was seen as something of national importance. They must know self-sacrifice, which means that even if they don't have food in their own plates, they must make sure that the people of their country do. Integrity goes down saying austerity. Normally you think of the life of a leader as being one of luxury. But it's said that a good leader should practice for their own spiritual furtherance, maybe by reducing the luxuries in their life. I think if you think of people more like Gandhi, then you see what is meant by how he practiced austerity for the good of his country. Non-anger. Anyone thinking of the example of Khrushchev? Heard that example? He got so upset about negotiations that he took off his shoe and hit it on the table to distract everyone else, which was very successful because everyone else forgot about what they were negotiating about, which happened to be to his benefit at that time. Non-violence. We think about how nations can get along without being violent to one another. I think it's probably a lot more challenging than just having an arms race. Patience and non-deviation from righteousness. Basically, what these things are teaching us is that if we consider more than our own personal spiritual practice, being a person who has a love of justice is also very important if you're going to go any further on the spiritual path. If you don't have a sense of justice, then you don't need to dream that you're going to be a person who's going to be good at social welfare, or a person who's really going to be able to help anyone outside your own close family, because you'll be on the road to disaster.
Aren't these values for everybody?
Sorry?
Aren't these values
these 10 values?
Right for everybody?
These 10 ones?
Yeah. I don't see
Then
anything which would not be right for other people.
It's all applicable to other people, but it's in many of these I don't see cropping up in other sets of virtues for householders and so on. They seem to be
anything in there which would be wrong for other people?
Nothing.
The sense of justice, I believe that in Buddhism one of the things is not to get attached to your emotions, and of course that's great when it's not getting attached to anger and greed and everything. But when you see injustice before your eyes or on the news, you get upset about it. It must be a fine balance between not getting attached to that anger at the injustice and being detached and sort of cold from it. It's a difficult one, I think.
I think you have to distinguish between getting upset about injustice and doing something about it. If you feel that injustice is wrong, then you should do something about it. And whether you're worked up about it or not doesn't make a difference. What makes a difference is whether you manage to do something about it. So really emotions shouldn't come into it. But rationally if something is unjust, then you shouldn't be able to agree with it. You don't have to get worked up as well. That sort of adds to the colour, adds the colour to the dealings. But supposing you can't do something about it, it still doesn't help to get worked up about it.
No.
But it's this thing which we had on the Tuesday course about knowing what you can change. And if you can't do something about it, then there are various ways of being patient about it. And patience is more about transforming that upset into something which is more positive. If you can't change something, then you should be asking yourself, well, why can't you change it? Why are you so insignificant and powerless that you can't do something about it? So at that point, you're asking yourself about what you could be doing to improve your own caliber, maybe, so that you might be in a position in the future to help out things like that, rather than getting violent about it, for example. But we are fairly pragmatic and realistic, and it's not that we let injustices go by without giving them a second thought. But sometimes we have to accept that even if we were to try, it wouldn't change anything.
So is it just a simple fact of accepting that you can't make that change, even though you've battled to point out that it's injustice?
You have to be realistic about your capability.
Okay.
And if you try to change things which is beyond what you can change, then that can ruin your life as well. And it doesn't benefit you or anyone else for that failure to happen. So it's better to realize what you can change and do what you can do.
But it's not easy to change, even when I want, really, it's not easy.
Any form of change is always painful. And even changing yourself is painful enough.
Change yourself.
So not to speak of trying to change other people or change other mechanisms, that's going to be even harder. So any form of change for the better does need a lot of patience. But the patience you need might be a little bit different from what you imagine. It doesn't mean just grinning and bearing it, but to transform and to use that energy to keep on trying until you can succeed, but to work in a way which is peaceful and in a way which doesn't aggravate people, but working so that people want to help you to do it. Some people ask me, how come in all these countries where Buddhism is in the majority, have they all got lousy governments? And they there was, if you read between the lines in that question, there seems that doesn't Buddhism teach you anything about running a country? In fact, it does. If you look at these 10 virtues, it's very clear about the sort of qualities which would make a country nice to live in according to Buddhist standards. But the trouble is, it's very hard to find a person who has these qualities. Most people who put themselves up for government have nowhere. If they have one of these qualities, it would be good going. And really, we tend to have lost touch with the sort of caliber of people who can really make it work. Maybe they'd be better off as a bachelor or as a mayor than as a president in some cases. It's hard work. Many people go into politics because they want personal benefits out of it. But that's the wrong intention from the beginning. It's doomed to failure. But if you want to be a person to change things, then you have to train yourself to a level where you can take on that sort of responsibility. And if you are too lazy to do that, then maybe you'd be better just keeping your head down and expecting less in life, and doing something for your family maybe would be a better way to spend your time if you don't want to train yourself to that sort of level. But there's a sort of succession to it. And if you do want to do something for the greater good, then you have to make sure that you have what it takes to be a platform for that sort of responsibility. It's not easy.
Could I ask the question differently? Because you put the emphasis, as if the person asking it was suggesting that Buddhist countries didn't have, things that you pointed out, the 10 factors that were ideal. So could I ask the same question, but in a different way? Why do Buddhist countries, when the majority of people are Buddhist, why don't they have practicing Buddhist leaders? Why out of the majority of Buddhists do non-exemplary, perhaps they're token Buddhists, why do they have the power? Why do they form the government? Is it because the whole sort of voting system is awry? Or?
I think you have to look back at where the system of government came from and why government was set up in the first place. If you think back to the Aganya Sutta, you can think back of that Genesis story I told you, and why there was government in the first place. Government only had a purpose to punish people who were beyond the help of who had lost their sense of conscience. You remember that?
I can't remember that part of it. It's the cosmology.
Yeah.
I can only remember certain elements of that.
So, really, a society which was an ideal society where people had a high-mindedness wouldn't need a government to tell them what to do. But when things get so bad in society that people are starting to lose their sense of conscience, then they need to set up some sort of structure to impose rules on people in society who are not behaving themselves. That was the origins of government in the first place. One thing which I tend to notice happens in Asian countries is that sometimes the government has made a real mess of its work and life goes on. It's like the government has its problems and it's sorting out its problems and everyone else sort of carries on with their lives as if the government was completely superfluous. I think if that happened here, there would be an uproar because everything seems to be so dependent on the government giving this or taking that. So it's almost like a different role which it tends to have.
I think we have to take the blame because democracy, we vote people in, and the politicians we have in this country at the moment, if that list of 10 virtues was what was required to get elected, they'd have all 10. The fact is they adopt the virtues that we want them to have, strength and building our village and doing the things we want them to do. So we take the blame, I think.
I think possibly we don't know what we're looking for,
Yeah.
so we tend to get exactly that. But it's a pity.
So life goes on in spite of the government, not because of it.
Yes, exactly. But I'll tell you a story just to finish off with. The idea of having kings at the head of states in the past has been something which goes back into ancient history though. And there's one particular example of the Buddha in a previous lifetime before he became enlightened. And he was born as a child into a royal family, so he was crown prince. But at that age he was only 7 or 8 years old. And his father thought he was doing a favour for his young son by helping to train him to be a high court judge from an early age. So whenever his father went into a court session, especially on cases which demanded capital punishment, he would have his young son lying in his lap and listening to the proceedings, so that he would start to hear about how things were done in a high court. But as with many children, once the young child cottoned on to what was happening in the court, that people were being sentenced to torture or death as a result of their crimes, the child remembered back to having fallen into hell realms for many lifetimes as a result of having done that job in the past. So because of having sentenced people to death in the past, he has suffered himself greatly over the course of many lifetimes. So thinking that he didn't want to replace his father as the person making more of that sort of karma, he pretended to be mute from that day onwards. And because from the age of 7 onwards he never said a word more to any of his family or anyone else, despite all efforts to beat him or to hold his head underwater until he said something, etc., etc. He wouldn't let a word pass his lips until eventually they gave up on him as being crown prince and found some other successor. And at that time he renounced the world and became a hermit somewhere, saying a few words to his executioner, who was flabbergasted. "Oh, you can still speak," and then climbing over the wall of the palace and disappearing, because he would prefer to lead a life of renunciation than to have to run a country in a way which went against his own principles. So it's these sort of quite extreme measures which leaders would go to in Buddhism to uphold standards of morality rather than letting power go to their head. So next Saturday will be, as I was saying, to do more with welfare work, blameless work, the sort of work you can do where you can feel completely satisfied about what you've done. And Tuesday nights will be about unconditionality in relationships, etc.